Hey everyone, it's been a while, but I'm back again doing some more Meshuggah note choice analysis stuff. So the whole point of this series was to eventually get to analyzing solos in Meshuggah, and we've kind of built up all the stuff we need to in terms of context. We've looked at how they build riffs and building up in complexity there, and then we've looked at layers, the kind of additional pieces of music they use to kind of build a complete sound. And finally, we're here at guitar solos. So I'm going to try and explain the important things with as little theory jargon as possible. So I want you to be able to watch this video without any music theory knowledge and still come away with a lot of useful information. Obviously, the more theory you know, the better you'll be able to understand the concepts and the quicker you'll be able to apply it. But I'm going to try and explain the concepts you need in as quickly and briefly as possible, so that we can get into Meshuggah and understanding Meshuggah. Okay, so let's very briefly cover the basic concepts of how chords work and guitar soloing normally works. So there are chords. Anytime you play 3 or more notes together, that's a chord. The most common kinds of chord are major and minor. So major chords, generally speaking, lean a little bit happier. Minor chords are a little bit darker and sadder. So I'll play you a couple of examples. So assuming you kind of vaguely understand now the rough vibe of major and minor, the next thing is to understand that when people play guitar solos, what they're trying to do generally is emphasize the notes in the chord. So whenever you hear a really good melodic guitar player, whether by ear or through understanding of music theory, usually both, they tend to try and emphasize the chords and the chord changes. So here's a couple of examples. Okay, so that was a real whistle-stop tour of how guitar soloing normally works. If you want a really good lesson on this from a kind of metal guitar angle, I think the best one is Melodic Control by Marty Friedman, and you should check that out. It's probably more useful than this lesson anyway. So as you might have guessed, Straws is not entirely a normal guitar solo, and I think there's some really interesting stuff to take away from it in terms of how minimalism enables ambiguity, and ambiguity enables a more complex emotional response to the music. So I think that's quite interesting, and hopefully I will convince you that in terms of how you approach this song, there are multiple possible musical and emotional interpretations, right? And that's part of what makes it so beautiful. Okay, so earlier I said Straws was fairly minimal, which facilitated ambiguity, multiple possible interpretations, which in the end created a more complex emotional response. So let's look at this context first. So do you remember the way I said most normal music is built up of major and minor chords? And what defines a chord being major or minor is the third. So that means if we took the first, third, and fifth notes of the scale, if the third note was major, it's a major scale and the chord is major. If the third is minor, so flattened the semitone, it's a minor scale or a minor chord. So is Straws Pulled at Random major or minor? Okay, so let's look at each part of Straws Pulled at Random, build up the context, understand what notes are available, and then from there it should be easy enough to tell if it's a major or minor key, right? So first of all, we have this little 3-note repeating pattern. So this goes all the way through. If I play a bit of it, you'll recognize it right away. Okay, and this doesn't change whenever the bass notes change. It's just literally 3 notes again and again and again. And unfortunately, it doesn't give us enough information. So these three notes by themselves do not have a major or a minor third. Maybe if we add some more context, we can rearrange the notes and create something that looks like a normal chord. But these three notes by themselves, just not enough information. And if you listen to them, do they sound happy to you? Do they sound sad to you? It's not clear. Okay, so what happens if we add more context? Well, there's not that much more context to add. So there is also a really simple bass line. So I'll play that alongside that note. There's also a kind of single note rhythm guitar accompaniment, and together they sound like this. So the way this personally feels to me is I'm getting three different perspectives on that repeating three note pattern, and the overall emotional impact of each is subtly different. So whenever I hear this opening first note, it feels tense but uplifting. Then whenever it shifts to the second note, it feels kind of bittersweet. Then when we move to the third fret note, it feels kind of mysterious but positive. And then when we get around to that last beat again, there's that moment of tension and uplift. So here's the start of our ambiguity. We have this three note repeating pattern, and we're relying on the other parts of the context to tell us how to feel about them. Are they major or minor? And we're going to see that the rest of the context changes. So it's like getting different perspectives on those same three notes. So there's something I'm really curious about here, which is that when I spoke to someone about this song, they were like, oh, it's great to hear Meshuggah play in a major key. And that's not how I hear it. And I think this song, it has two viable different harmonic interpretations, or probably more, to be honest. But I'm going to give you two to choose between, and it's going to be like Yanni and Laurel, or the black and blue versus white and gold dress in the comments. So please comment and let me know which one you hear. I would guess that it's 80-20 the way I hear it, but we'll get to that. But let's say we did want to nail down these two possible interpretations, right? And whether or not you understand music theory or not is not super important. It's how do you hear this, and I'll give you a very clear way of telling which one is the interpretation for you. So these are the four chords that make up this song. So if you took all the notes that were being played at the same time and you just play them all at once, you end up with this sound. Okay, and here's the litmus test. Does that all sound like basically the same chord and kind of major, or does it sound like three different chords? The first one major, the second one kind of ambiguous, the third one kind of ambiguous, and then the final one major again. Because for me, it's the second one. It does feel like a journey between different chords, but each chord is itself kind of complex and mysterious. Other people, my friend included, hear this as kind of one quite static major sound. So it's kind of all one big major chord, and it's just playing different bits of it. And to go into the kind of theoretical basis for that very quickly, what I did was I looked at each chord, and I took the notes, and I tried to come up with viable interpretations, trying to find things with ideally a root, a third, and a fifth, which is not possible as far as I can see. So those would be the basic major and minor chords. And we just don't have the ingredients to build a standard major or minor chord in any of these. And if I couldn't find a root, third, and fifth, I looked for a root, third, seventh. Right, that would be a good second bet. And the thing is, basically for all of these, you can find like a B flat 7-ish sound that works for all of them. by that I mean like a B dominant chord, kind of major, but a little bit more tense, Mixolydian kind of sound. Or alternatively, you can kind of hear Mixolydian, Mixolydian, Dorian, Lydian, Mixolydian. And that's kind of the way I hear it. So I hear this one as kind of like happy and tense, kind of bittersweet, mysterious but positive, and back into happy but tense. Right, that's the way I hear that journey. And what's interesting is when I play like this, just like 4 block bar chords, that makes me hear it much more major, much more static. This sounds more boring to me than the actual song, which makes sense, because it is. But yeah, so those are the 2 interpretations I would suggest. So those are 2 different, but in my opinion, valid interpretations of this context. So one is that there's an overall kind of B flat 11 sound, and that each bar just draws on different flavors from that sound, right? Then the other interpretation which I've suggested is that it does have that B11 sound to start and finish, but in the meantime it visits these kind of ambiguous but different flavors. So it goes Dorian, but it's not super obviously Dorian, right? It doesn't have the third, so it's hard to tell if it's major or minor. It goes Lydian, but it doesn't go super obviously Lydian. Again, it doesn't have the third. You can tell it's Lydian because it's got the root 5th and sharp 11th, so there's no other diatonic interpretation of that, but it's still ambiguous. But that's the way I hear it anyway. So the reason we've done all that before we discuss the solo is it massively changes your interpretation of the solo depending on how you hear the context. It's like whether you watch Blade Runner and think Deckard is a replicant or Deckard is not a replicant. It makes the film different. It makes it feel different. And in the same way, the solo feels quite different and should be interpreted differently based on which context you think is correct. And again, for the non-music theory people in the audience, it's something you should be able to tell by ear and feel. Does this feel like one chord to you, or does this feel like multiple ones, right? Do you feel different each time those notes change? Anyway, so let's look at the solo itself and how the notes work. So let's analyze this solo first from the simpler perspective that all of the background are just different versions of B flat 11. And so the whole thing has one long sustained Mixolydian sound. That makes it much simpler to understand. So let's look at that first. So there's one scale you need to know, and it's B flat Mixolydian. And it sounds like this. In terms of Mixolydian soloing, what we'd expect to see is an emphasis on the major third and the perfect fifth, and that eventually the solo is going to make its way back home to the root note. So what I want you to do now is, as we go through this solo, you can look at the fretboard here I've got on screen, and you can compare it to the 3 notes I predicted would make up the majority of the soloing. So that is, once again, the third, the fifth, and eventually coming home to the root. So let's have a listen to it. Okay, so hopefully what you saw was the same as what I saw. So this opening phrase, right, so it's 2 8-bar phrases, so it's almost the same twice, the ending's slightly different. The first phrase revolves entirely around the third of the scale, so that's D here. Goes up to the fifth of the scale here, and then back down to the root. and then it goes to the second of the scale. And that's a very common way to end a kind of a major phrase, right? So if you're doing the first phrase of a solo, you want it to sound unfinished, you don't end on the root, but you end on the second. And this creates a little bit of tension, and then next time around you want it to go back down to the root. And then next time around, same phrase, focusing on the third of the scale. This one going back up to the fifth, down to the root, and then it gradually goes down to the fifth. So in traditional classical music theory, you go to the dominant, the fifth degree of the scale, whenever you want to build tension, right, that you have to resolve in the next bit. And that's where we go next. We go into the crushing riff that ends the song. So it makes sense that the solo doesn't want to end on the calm, chill root note. It kind of wants to take you home and then go, whoa, we're going to space. And that's exactly what it does here. Okay, so that's the quote-unquote simpler perspective. Let's look at the slightly more complex perspective. There are 3 different chords, because the first chord and the last chord of the progression are the same. So we're going to look at 3 different scales. So the first one is still B flat Mixolydian. The second one is F Dorian. And then the third one is A flat Lydian. And what you may notice is these are all relative to each other. So it's actually the same set of 7 notes are in each scale, but we think of them from different perspectives, which is of course the theme of the video for those of you who are catching on now. And just to hear those again, those are B flat Mixolydian, F Dorian, and A flat Lydian. And what I'd expect is for each part of the solo that sits in the relevant scale to emphasize that scale's color tones. So when we're in Mixolydian, I'd expect to be hearing lots of the third and the seventh, with maybe some of the second thrown in there. When we're in F Dorian, I'd really want to hear the minor third, the major sixth. That's kind of what brings out that sound. And when we're in C Lydian, I'd like to hear some combination of second, third, fifth, sharp 4. With sharp 4 being the most important, but with the other notes giving it enough support to work. Any of y'all that love Lydian will know what I mean by that. Okay, so let's look at the solo from that perspective. Because this is more complicated, let's take it 1 chord at a time. So the first 2 beats, Mixolydian. Yeah, that's all we need. Yeah, so there's the major third there. Just like before with the simpler interpretation, but now we're hearing only this bit, Mixolydian. Then the next bits, which are all kind of F Dorian, so we expect a kind of bittersweet sound, folks, minor third, major 6. So to clarify from a kind of Dorian perspective, what we've got going on here is the 5th, the major 6th, and the minor 7th. So yeah, that's kind of Dorian sounding. And then that's the root there at the end in a kind of Dorian context. And then onwards into the A flat Lydian context, what we have is a lot of silence there at the end. But that's from the second going up to the major third. So definitely a kind of major sounding solo over that context. And then the end, again, Mixolydian. Right, and then it kind of goes around again. So when you see the solo from those 2 perspectives, there's 2 different solos there. There's one that's kind of quite a straightforward, broadly major sounding Mixolydian solo that hits all the Mixolydian signposts apart from the flat 7. And then you have an alternative, which is you have a slightly more complex solo that shifts to each chord, and even if it doesn't hit the sharp 4 in Lydian, it certainly hits the major third in the Mixolydian. It hits the flat 7th, the major 6th in the Dorian, and it hits the major third and major second in the Lydian. So it's hitting a reasonable amount of the color of each of the scales. And both of these, I think, are viable ways to hear this solo. So if you hear the solo as one big major sounding thing, I think that's reasonable. And because that's simpler, I might even suggest that it's more likely it was written like that. And it's worth pointing out there are multiple cases where artists write a thing hearing one thing and the audience hears a different thing back. And there's a great video essay about how this happened with Radiohead's Videotape, where the band hear it half a beat differently from the audience, which is really cool. And it's important to note how you feel about this music doesn't necessarily depend on how complex your understanding of music is. I heard this as more ambiguous, more jazzy, before I had all the theory chops I do now. In fact, what's funny is it was only when I came to actually work on this video that I even started to hear the simpler interpretation, right? So ironically, as my theory skills have advanced, my hearing has looked for a simpler way to understand this. So I'm really curious for how many people listening to this video, how many of you are now able, like a seeing eye picture, to flip between the two illusions, to hear it as major and then to hear it as more ambiguous and complex. It's also worth pointing out that perhaps all of our vocabulary around this stuff has become a little dated. I don't necessarily think that major, minor, Mixolydian, Lydian, that these are the right ways to think about this, right? It really is just 3 notes and a bass line. And it seems to me that the vocabulary we have to use to describe that is more complex than it needs to be. Or perhaps that's just my fault for explaining it badly. But there's certainly a good case made by Adam Neely in one of his videos that a lot of the way we traditionally approach harmony doesn't necessarily work for modern popular music. And that includes both Leonard Skinner and Meshuggah, believe it or not. So of course, no discussion of Meshuggah would be complete without looking at the groove. So what is the groove here? How does it work? And how does the solo tie into that? So it's quite simple. There are a few different interpretations. So here they go. Number 1, it's in 4/4, but syncopated. So this is the way the band actually hear most of their own music, is it's just 4/4 with some weirdness. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to hear this. Another way to hear this is it's 4/4 with an extra set of underlying meters. So it's polymetric, and I think this is more like how I hear it. So again, we have 2 possible perspectives. You can play in 4/4, you can play in this complex cycle of time signatures. So what do Meshuggah do for solos? So there's an interesting thing where with vocals in Meshuggah, sometimes they'll move between the two. So sometimes they'll quite clearly follow the syncopation in the complex meters, and sometimes they'll quite clearly follow the straight 4/4. So here's a couple of examples to convince you that that happens. So the way it works in this solo is it starts quite loose, so it doesn't follow the 4/4 or the complex time signatures particularly closely. It's not landing on the accented beats of 4/4 or on the accented beats of the underlying complex meters in the polymeter. And then it ties in tightly to the complex time signatures. So it's really closely following exactly the syncopated groove. So every one of these notes lands on the second short pulse of the underlying complex meters, where the snare hits when you listen to the track. And then again, the last notes are loose. So I'll just play this with my interpretation of the complex meters, and you can hear every time the snare hits, even though there's different numbers of long and short pulses, that's when you expect the notes. So loose, tied to the snare, loose again. And this is the trickiest thing for me, is this note. I think that it is picked again. So even though it's still the same fretted note, still the 13th fret here, I think it is picked again very subtly, and a little tiny bit of vibrato is added. When you listen to them live, Frederick really accents this note, which isn't accented on the studio recording. So speaking of the articulation, it's worth pointing out that although there are lots of slides in this solo, the vibrato is minimal and understated. It's kind of barely there. And to me, this is a great use of kind of understatement. I think if you really went for the wild Randy Rhoads vibrato on this track, it wouldn't work. And something that blew my mind about Sean Lane's playing was he had this wonderful breadth of vibrato, including knowing when to add no vibrato at all. And that's a really valid artistic choice that is sometimes exactly correct. Speaking of articulation, when you have this kind of playing where there's lots of slides and relatively little vibrato, and this whole solo fits in quite a narrow melodic range, it makes me think it was probably composed mostly playing up and down one string. And when you attend Berklee, one of the things they make you do, or used to make you do, I've looked up their syllabus since, is learn to play guitar solos up and down one string. And it forces you to write more singable melodies, because you can't just shred through a 2-octave scale when you're playing on one string. So if you're struggling to write melodic solos, a good way to approach things is, if I could only move one finger up and down one string, because at the end of the day, the human voice has difficulty making large jumps, what would I have to play? And it forces you to write more singable melodies, like this one, I think. One final thing is, I would guess this solo was played along like the unwound strings of the 8 strings. But when Frederick plays it, he plays it up higher on the neck on the lower strings. And this makes sense because they're huge guitars and they're difficult to play on live. So I transcribed this solo kind of where Frederick plays it live, rather than where I think it was played on the recording. Yeah, so I think that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this thorough dissection of Straws Pulled at Random. There's probably a lot more analysis here than solo, because the solo is so short and there's a lot of interesting things here. I think there's key takeaways here in that you can do an awful lot with relatively little musical material. So it's literally 3 notes in the bass and 3 repeating notes in the treble, and that's it. For all the beautiful background context. And then those notes get rearranged if you want to make the heavy riff out of them. The solo itself, it's kind of, it could all be played on one string. It's quite singable. You only need to know one scale, really, to play it. And there'd be nothing stopping someone like, you could only be playing a year or two and write a solo like this, technically speaking. So I think it's important to be aware that it's not just about increasing in your ability to play complex music. It's also your ability to recognize and create beauty. So I don't know whether they wrote the heavy riff first, just the little 3-note repeating pattern first, or if they came up with the groove first. But you can see by refusing to add a lot of stuff and sticking to strong fundamental ideas. So you have this ambiguous chord, you have a simple repeating groove, and you have a singable solo, and you put those together and you get something fantastic. If you'd added like 12 key changes and 6-note chords, you wouldn't have added something, you would have taken something away. So I think it's really important to be able to recognize when you should add very little, which is incredibly difficult. So good luck with that. Take care.